A police officer followed a little black girl to a cafe every day because he thought she was doing something wrong. But when he found out the real reason why she was going there, it made him cry. Subscribe to find out what happens next and let us know where you are watching from. Outside a busy cafe, a little girl named Nina sat quietly on the sidewalk. She was only 9 years old and hugged a worn-out notebook close to her, her thin arms wrapped around it like it was the most important thing in the world. Nina looked inside the cafe through the big windows, her wide brown eyes filled with longing. The soft golden light coming from the cafe made her feel warm and a little closer to the memory of her dad. Inside, people laughed, talked, and enjoyed cups of hot coffee and yummy pastries. The sound of clinking dishes, happy conversations, and bursts of laughter made the cafe feel full of life and joy. But for Nina, this wasn't just any cafe. This cafe was special. It was the place where her dad had promised they would celebrate together when he came home from the war. But sadly, he never did. Every day after school, Nina came to this spot. She didn't need to go inside the cafe to feel close to her dad. Just sitting outside was enough. She would watch people walk by and imagine what it would have been like if her dad were still alive. She could almost hear his warm, deep voice saying, "One day, we'll sit here and eat the biggest slice of chocolate cake they have, just you and me." Nina's dad, Sergeant David Thompson, wasn't just her father. He was her hero. He had taught her how to ride a bike, tie her shoes, and always be strong. But being strong was getting harder and harder for Nina every day. In her hands was her notebook, filled with letters to her dad. She had written to him every day since the day they got the terrible news about his death. In these letters, she told him about her day, her friends, her fears, and the things that made her happy. It was her way of keeping him close, even though she knew he was gone. Today, Nina's letter started like this. "Hi, Dad. I miss you. Today was okay. I got a B on my math quiz. Sorry, I know you told me to study harder." She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper as her heart ached. "I came to our cafe again. I know you would have liked it today. It smells like cinnamon. You always liked cinnamon." Tears started to fill her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. Her dad wouldn't want her to cry. He had always told her to be strong, no matter what. As she wrote, a shadow fell over her. She looked up and saw a tall police officer standing across the street. His name was Officer Daniel Reed, and he had seen Nina sitting there many times before. To him, it didn't look like the habit of a sad little girl. It looked suspicious. Why would a young girl sit outside a cafe every day, alone? Officer Reed was used to being careful and suspicious. Years of being a police officer had made him think that way. When he saw people from certain neighborhoods, especially black kids like Nina, he sometimes thought they might be causing trouble. He didn't mean to be mean, but that's just how he had learned to think. So when he saw Nina sitting there every day, he assumed something was wrong. Nina noticed the way the officer looked at her. His eyes were sharp and full of suspicion, making her feel nervous. She had done nothing wrong, but his stare made her feel like she had. Her heart began to race, and she clutched her notebook even tighter. As the minutes passed, Nina felt more and more scared. The officer didn't move. His gaze felt heavy, like it was trapping her there. What had once been a warm, safe place now felt uncomfortable and scary. She didn't know if she could keep coming to the cafe anymore, even though she had promised her dad she would. She looked down at her notebook and wrote one last line to her dad. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Dad. It's too hard." She closed the notebook and sighed, tracing its worn edges with her fingers. It was the last thing she had of him. Her dad, the cafe, and the memories were all she had left. As the sun started to set, Nina knew she had to leave. The officer was still watching her, and her fear had grown too strong to ignore. She stood up slowly, tucked the notebook under her arm, and gave the cafe one last look. "I'll come back tomorrow," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She had to come back because she had promised her dad. Even though it was hard, she would do it for him. As Nina walked away, she could still feel the officer's eyes on her. She knew this wasn't the last time they would see each other. Something bigger was happening, and even though she didn't understand it yet, she knew it wasn't over. With one last glance at the cafe, she whispered, "I love you, Dad," and walked away, holding the notebook tightly to her chest. Across the street, Officer Reed watched her go, making a note to keep an eye on her. Whatever this girl was up to, he was going to find out. Nina was sitting on the sidewalk across from a cafe, thinking of her dad. She missed him so much since he passed away. Every day, she came to this spot to write in her notebook, pretending to talk to him. It made her feel closer to him. But today, she saw Officer Reed again. He was leaning against his police car, looking right at her. He looked serious, and Nina could feel that he didn't trust her. Her stomach hurt with worry. She tried to make herself look smaller, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but he started walking over. His boots made loud sounds as he crossed the street. Nina's heart began to beat faster. She hugged her notebook tightly to her chest like it could protect her. Officer Reed stopped right in front of her, towering over her. "You again?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it. "What are you doing here every day, kid?" Nina's mouth felt dry, and she stared at the ground, too scared to answer. She wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Officer Reed said, sounding more serious now. "Are you waiting for someone? Planning something?" Nina quickly shook her head, still looking at the ground. She wanted to speak, but her fear made it hard. She remembered her dad's voice telling her to be strong, but she felt so small and scared. Officer Reed sighed and rubbed the back of his neck like he was frustrated. "Look, I don't know what you're up to, but people don't just sit outside cafes every day for no reason. So, tell me, why are you really here?" Nina clutched her notebook even tighter, her fingers turning white. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The officer's questions felt like they were pushing all the air out of her lungs. She thought of her dad again, hearing him in her head saying, "Be strong, baby girl, no matter what." But how could she be strong when she felt so weak? Officer Reed crouched down to her level, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "What's in the notebook? Let me see." "No," Nina shouted, the word coming out before she could stop it. She felt panic rise inside her. That notebook was her special connection to her dad. Letting him see it would feel like giving a piece of her heart to a stranger who wouldn't understand. Reed frowned, his eyes filled with even more suspicion. "Why not? What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything," Nina whispered, her voice shaky. "Please, just leave me alone." The officer stood up and sighed again. "Look, I don't want trouble, kid, but if I see you here again tomorrow, I'll have to start asking more serious questions." Tears stung Nina's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry in front of him. Her dad wouldn't want her to cry, but the sadness in her chest hurt so much. She felt like everything was closing in on her. Officer Reed shook his head and muttered, "Kids these days," as he walked away. Nina sat there, feeling lost and scared. For the first time since her dad died, the cafe didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt scary, like everything she had left of her dad was slipping away. She looked down at her notebook, her vision blurry with tears she didn't want to let out. She wrote, "Dad, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I tried to be strong, but it's getting harder. I wish you were here." The words felt heavy, like she was saying something she wasn't ready to admit, even to herself. But she couldn't stop writing. It was the only way she still felt connected to her dad, the only way to feel like he was still with her. As the sun began to set, Nina closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm. She stood up, looking one last time at the cafe window where the warm lights flickered. For a moment, she imagined her dad sitting across from her, smiling and telling her everything would be okay. But then the vision faded and the emptiness came back. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and whispered, "I'll come back tomorrow, Dad. I promise." She walked away, her heart feeling heavy with sadness she couldn't put into words. Across the street, Officer Reed watched her go. Still feeling suspicious, he was determined to find out what the girl was hiding. He decided that the next time he saw her, he wouldn't be so easy on her. The next day, the weather was cold and the wind made the leaves dance on the sidewalk. Nina walked slowly toward the cafe, holding her notebook close. Her heart felt even heavier today, and every step was harder than the last. She had almost decided not to come back. The fear from her last meeting with Officer Reed was still fresh in her mind, and it made her want to stay far away. But she had promised her dad, and she couldn't break that promise. When she reached the cafe, Nina hesitated. She looked around nervously, searching for any sign of Officer Reed. She just wanted to sit by the window and write her letter in peace. But as soon as she thought she was safe, she heard the sound of boots again. Her heart sank. She turned and saw Officer Reed walking toward her, looking frustrated. "Well, look who decided to come back," he said with sarcasm in his voice. He stopped in front of her, his tall body blocking the sunlight. "Didn't I tell you I didn't want to see you here again?" Nina tried to speak, but her voice was stuck again. She felt her whole body tense up with fear. She shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "I'm talking to you, kid," Reed said, his patience running out. He grabbed her arm, and Nina's fear turned to panic. She tried to pull away, but his grip only got tighter. "Please, just let me go," she begged. But Reed wasn't listening. He pulled the notebook out of her hands and opened it, ignoring her cries. He expected to find something bad, but instead he found pages and pages of letters. They were messy, handwritten letters, all starting with the word Dad. His frown deepened as he read a few lines. The letters weren't anything bad. They were just Nina talking about her day, her school, and how much she missed her dad. Reed's face softened, confused. "What is this?" he muttered, his grip loosening. Nina's face was red from crying, her eyes wide with fear. It's for my dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. She reached for the notebook, her whole body shaking. "Please, give it back." Reed stared at her for a long moment, starting to understand. He looked at the notebook again. One letter said, "I miss you, Dad. I hope you're proud of me." He looked back at Nina and saw the sadness in her eyes. She wasn't a troublemaker, she was just a kid who missed her dad. But it was too late. People had started gathering around them, watching what was happening. Some even took out their phones to record. Nina felt everyone staring at her, judging her. Her face burned with shame and fear. "Please," she whispered, barely able to speak, "just let me go." Finally, Reed let go of her arm and handed back the notebook. He took a step back, looking at the ground. He felt bad for treating her like she had done something wrong. She was just a sad girl who missed her dad. Nina grabbed her notebook, hugged it to her chest, and ran away, leaving Reed standing there feeling guilty. He had been wrong, and he knew it now. Nina held her notebook tightly to her chest. She was telling the truth. "Go home, kid," the officer said. His voice was quieter now, almost unsure. "Just go home." Nina didn't wait. She turned and ran as fast as she could, not stopping or looking back until she was far away from the cafe, the officer, and the people. When she finally stopped, she was several blocks away, breathing hard and feeling shaky. She leaned against a wall, her eyes stinging with tears, still clutching her notebook. She brushed her fingers over the cover, making sure it was still there. How did everything go so wrong, she thought. Nina slid down the wall, sitting on the cold ground as tears rolled down her cheeks. She opened her notebook, her vision blurry from the tears. The words were smudged where Officer Reed had touched them, and new tears filled her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I tried to keep coming back, but I don't think I can do it anymore. I'm scared, Dad. I'm so scared. She hugged her knees, her shoulders shaking as she cried quietly. She had promised her father to be strong, but right now she didn't feel strong at all. She felt small, scared, and alone. She wished her father could be there to hold her and tell her that everything would be okay. Meanwhile, Officer Reed stood near the cafe watching the crowd of people leave. He could hear their murmurs and see their disapproving looks. He clenched his fists, feeling angry and unsure. He thought he was doing his job, keeping the neighborhood safe, but now, standing here, he wasn't sure anymore. He thought about the girl's notebook and the words he had read. I miss you, Dad. He didn't see a bad kid. He saw a sad daughter trying to hold on to her father's memory in the only way she knew. Guilt washed over him. He prided himself on being a good cop, on trusting his instincts, but now he wondered if his instincts had been wrong. Had he misjudged her? Nina finally reached home. Her feet dragged as she walked through the door. Her mother looked up from the kitchen, her face softening when she saw Nina's tear-streaked face. Nina, sweetheart, what happened? Her mother asked, rushing over and kneeling in front of her. Nina shook her head, unable to speak. She just wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tightly. Her mother hugged her back, stroking her hair gently and whispering, It's okay, baby. You're home now. You're safe. Nina didn't know if she could ever go back to the cafe. She didn't know if she could keep her promise to her father. But right now, in her mother's arms, she felt a little safer, a little more comforted. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough for now. The mistaken arrest had left a scar. For Nina, it was a reminder of how quickly her world could change from safe to scary. For Officer Reed, it was a hard lesson. He realized how easily he could misjudge someone, how his fears and biases could hurt the very people he was supposed to protect. Their paths were far from over. As Nina held on to her mother and Officer Reed stood alone at the cafe, both knew that this was just the beginning of something they didn't fully understand yet. Days later, the door to the police station creaked open, and Nina sat on a hard wooden bench, holding her notebook tightly. She stared down at her shoes, feeling small and out of place in the cold, bright room. Every sound, from the click of handcuffs to the hum of voices, made her feel more scared. She just wanted to disappear, to wake up from this bad dream and be back at the cafe, writing in her notebook. Officer Daniel Reed stood nearby, leaning against the counter with crossed arms, waiting. His frustration simmered. He thought he had done the right thing, but something about the situation bothered him. The way the girl held onto her notebook, the fear in her eyes, it didn't feel right. Suddenly, the station door opened again and a woman rushed inside, her face full of panic and anger. It was Nina's mother, Sarah. She hurried to Nina's side. "Nina," she cried, kneeling down and hugging her daughter. "Are you okay? What happened, baby?" Nina buried her face in her mother's shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. Sarah held her tightly, brushing her hair gently. Then she stood up and turned to face Officer Reed. Her expression changed from worry to anger. "Why was my daughter brought here?" she asked, her voice sharp and angry. "What did she do?" Reed straightened up, caught off guard by her tone. "She was acting suspiciously," he began, trying to sound calm. "She was hanging around outside the cafe every day. I asked her a few questions and she wouldn't answer. I had to investigate." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Investigate? She's 9 years old." Reed opened his mouth to reply, but Sarah cut him off. "You think a little girl sitting by herself is a threat? Did you even stop to ask yourself why she was there?" Reed shifted uncomfortably. "She wouldn't tell me," he muttered. "She didn't have to tell you," Sarah snapped. "You could have asked me before dragging her here." Nina listened to the heated argument, her tears turning into quiet sniffles. Her mother was angry, but beneath the anger was a deep sadness, one that matched Nina's own. Sarah turned back to her daughter, kneeling down again. "It's okay, baby. Tell me what happened," she said softly. Nina hesitated, then slowly handed her notebook to her mother. "He took this from me," she whispered. Sarah's eyes softened as she took the notebook and ran her fingers over its worn cover. She knew exactly what was inside. She had watched Nina fill its pages every day, writing letters to her father, letters he would never read. Sarah stood up, holding the notebook tightly, and turned to face Officer Reed again. "You want to know why my daughter sits by that cafe every day?" she asked, her voice heavy with sadness. "Because that was their place. My husband, her father, took her there every day before he left for his final tour." Reed blinked, the words hitting him hard. "Her father?" he repeated, his voice quieter. "Yes," Sarah's voice cracked, but she continued. "He promised her that when he came back, they'd go there and celebrate, but he never got the chance." Reed felt his throat tighten. "He didn't come back," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with both pride and heartbreak. "He died in Afghanistan. He saved his whole unit. They gave him a medal and a folded flag, but that doesn't fill the hole he left behind." Sarah glanced down at the notebook in her hands, her fingers trembling. This notebook is all Nina has left of him. These letters, they're the only way she knows how to keep him close. Reed felt the weight of her words like a heavy stone in his chest. The notebook he had taken from Nina, the suspicion that led him to treat her like a criminal, it all seemed so wrong now. He had looked at her and seen trouble, but really, she was just a little girl trying to hold on to the memory of her father. Guilt crashed over him. He thought he was doing his job, but now he realized how deeply he had misjudged her. Sarah pulled Nina closer, her eyes never leaving Reed. "I don't want you near my daughter again," she said firmly. "You've done enough damage." Reed nodded slowly, knowing there was nothing he could say to make it right. He had crossed a line and he couldn't undo it. Sarah turned to Nina and spoke softly. "Come on, baby. Let's go home." Nina hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Officer Reed. There was no anger in her eyes, only sadness, deep and heavy. Then she turned and followed her mom out of the police station, holding her notebook tightly. Officer Reed watched them leave, off feeling the weight of his mistake grow heavier. He had thought he was doing the right thing, protecting his community, but instead he had hurt an innocent child. For the first time in a long while, Officer Daniel Reed felt like he had really failed. Officer Reed sat alone in his police car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The soft voices and static from the radio filled the silence, but he wasn't listening. His mind was far away, lost in the memory of Sarah Thompson's words and the sad look in little Nina's eyes. He had been doing his job, right? Protecting the neighborhood and following his instincts. But now those instincts felt like a curse, twisting his sense of duty into something dark and harmful. He had seen danger where there was none. He had taken a grieving child and made her safe place into a place of fear. The guilt gnawed at him, growing heavier with each passing moment. He thought about all the times he told himself he wasn't prejudiced. "I treat everyone the same," he had said to himself for years, as if saying it would make it true. But now, sitting in his quiet car, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. He had treated Nina differently, not because she had done anything wrong, but because of the color of her skin. Reed leaned back in his seat, rubbing his face with his hand. He remembered the way Nina had held onto her notebook like it was her only lifeline. He also remembered how Sarah's voice cracked when she talked about her husband's death. "He saved his entire unit," she had said. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. A man who had given his life for his country, and Reed had taken away the only thing his daughter had left, her letters and memories. Reed pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes. His chest ached with something unfamiliar. It was guilt, yes, but also shame, deep, aching shame. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on doing the right thing. But now he wondered how many other times he had let his biases guide his actions. How many innocent people had suffered because of his fear and prejudice? A memory surfaced from his childhood, a time when he had felt powerless and unseen. His older brother Lucas had always protected him back then, standing up for him when the world felt too big and scary. But Lucas was gone now, lost to addiction and bad decisions. Reed had buried that part of his past deep inside, thinking that being tough and becoming a cop was the only way to survive. But now, sitting alone in his car, he realized how much he had lost along the way. What if that had been me? Reed thought, the question cutting through him like a knife. What if it had been Lucas's daughter sitting there writing letters to him? He had failed Nina, and there was no denying it. The worst part was that there was no way to go back and undo the harm he had caused. But maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The thought scared him. It would mean facing his own flaws, admitting he wasn't the man he thought he was. It would mean stepping outside the safety of his police badge and confronting the parts of himself he had tried so hard to hide, but he had to try. Reed sat up straighter, the weight in his chest shifting a little, though it didn't completely lift. He knew what he had to do, even if the path ahead was uncertain and frightening. He had to find a way to show Nina he was sorry, not just with words, but with actions. He glanced at a small, crumpled note with an address scribbled on it. It was the address of a cafe. He didn't know exactly what he would do when he got there, but he knew it had to start there, at the place where everything had gone wrong. Reed took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the police station. The city lights blurred outside the windows. He didn't know if he could ever fully make up for what he had done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something new inside him. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. Hope. Nina sat on her bed with her notebook open on her lap. She had tried to write another letter to her dad, but the words wouldn't come. Her hand hovered over the page, her pencil shaking in her grip. She wanted to tell him everything about the officer and how she felt like she had failed him. But the words stayed locked inside her, too tangled and heavy to set free. Her mom's voice drifted in from the kitchen, soft and steady as she hummed an old lullaby. It was the same song she used to sing when Nina was little, back when the world felt safer and her father's laughter filled their home. Nina closed her eyes, letting the familiar melody wrap around her like a blanket. For a moment, she imagined her father sitting beside her, his arm around her shoulders, telling her everything would be okay. But when she opened her eyes, the room was empty, and the ache in her chest returned, heavier than before. She flipped to a blank page in her notebook and slowly wrote, her letters shaky but determined. I tried, Dad. I really did, but it's so hard without you. I feel like I'm losing you all over again. She stared at the words for a long time, then added one more line. I wish you were here. Her mom came into the room carrying a cup of hot cocoa. Here, sweetheart, she said, placing the cup on the nightstand. I thought you could use this. Nina nodded slightly, still looking at her notebook. Her mom sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It's okay to miss him, she whispered. It's okay to feel sad. Nina leaned into her mom's embrace, her small body shaking as the tears she had held back for so long finally came. Her mom held her tightly, rocking her gently as she cried, whispering soothing words. It's going to be okay, baby, her mom murmured. We're going to be okay. And for the first time since her father's death, Nina let herself believe those words, even if only a little. Meanwhile, Officer Reed parked his patrol car a block away from the cafe, sitting in silence for a moment before stepping out. The night air was cool, and the streets were quiet. He walked slowly toward the cafe, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was going to say when he saw Nina again. Apologies felt empty, and words alone wouldn't be enough. But he was determined to try, no matter how hard it would be. As he reached the cafe, He stood outside for a moment, staring at the place where Nina had sat every day. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but beneath it was something else, a resolve to do better. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. It was time to start again. The sky had turned dark blue as the sun disappeared, and the lights of the cafe cast a warm, golden glow across the sidewalk. Inside, the tables were set up for a special evening, one meant to honor a hero and to mend a broken connection. Officer Reed stood awkwardly by the entrance, feeling the weight of his guilt and uncertainty pressing down on him. He glanced around and saw a small memorial in the corner of the cafe, a framed photograph of Sergeant David Thompson in his uniform, surrounded by candles and white lilies. Reed felt regret sting him again as he looked at the picture. This man, who had given his life for people like him, had been dishonored by Reed's careless actions. And now Reed had hurt the person Sergeant Thompson had left behind, his daughter. The cafe door swung open, and Nina and her mom walked in. Nina clutched her notebook tightly, her eyes wide with confusion and worry. She hadn't known what to expect when her mom told her they were coming here tonight. Now, standing in the warm glow of the cafe, she felt a deep sadness for her dad and for the comfort this place used to give her. Reed cleared his throat and took a step forward. "Nina," he began softly, his voice shaky. But before he could continue, the cafe owner, Mr. Mendoza, walked over with a kind smile. "Welcome," he said, gently guiding them toward the memorial. "This is for you." Nina's eyes widened when she saw the photo of her dad. She took a sharp breath and felt tears well up in her eyes. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the frame as if touching it would bring her dad closer. "For your dad," Mr. Mendoza added kindly. "We wanted to honor him and you." Nina stared at the picture for a long moment, her heart filled with emotions too big to explain. She hugged her notebook tighter, her small hands trembling. Reed took a step closer, his eyes on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't understand. I saw you sitting there, and I let my fears and prejudice blind me. I know words aren't enough, but I'm truly sorry, Nina." Nina looked up at him, her face hard to read. The officer's apology hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's up to you, sweetheart," she whispered. "You don't have to forgive him if you're not ready." For a moment, the room was silent. Nina's small, tear-filled eyes met Reed's, and the weight of everything that had happened seemed to hang between them. Then, slowly, Nina opened her notebook and turned to a blank page. She picked up her pen and began to write. The sound of her pen scratching on paper was the only noise in the room. When she finished, she carefully tore the page out and held it out to Reed. Reed hesitated, looking between the paper and her face, then reached out with shaking hands to take it from her. The note was short and simple. "I forgive you." Reed felt his throat tighten and he blinked rapidly, trying to keep his emotions in check. He looked back at Nina, humbled by her quiet strength. "Thank you," he whispered. The cafe door opened again and several veterans walked in. Their faces were marked with years of service and sacrifice. They greeted Sarah warmly, sharing stories about David Thompson's bravery and kindness. Nina stood quietly, listening to every word. Each story felt like a new piece of her father she could keep forever. One of the veterans kneeled down beside her and said softly, "Your dad was a hero, not just for what he did for us, but because of how much he loved you. He talked about you all the time." Nina's heart filled with pride, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. A small, shy smile, but still a smile. As the evening went on, the cafe filled with warmth and laughter. Mr. Mendoza, the cafe owner, brought out a big chocolate cake, just like the one her father had promised they'd share when he came back. Nina sat at a table surrounded by people who had known her father, people who understood her loss. Officer Reed watched from a distance, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. He knew he had a long way to go and that one evening couldn't fix all the mistakes he had made. But tonight he had taken the first step toward being the man he wanted to be, the man her father had fought for, the man Nina deserved to see in uniform. Before the night ended, Officer Reed walked over to Nina one last time. "If you ever need anything," he said gently, "I'm here. I'll always be here." Nina nodded, her eyes showing she understood. As the cafe emptied and the candles flickered low, Nina sat quietly at her father's memorial, her notebook open in front of her. She picked up her pen and wrote a message for her dad. "Hi, Dad. Today was a good day. I think you'd be proud of me. I'm going to keep coming back to our cafe, and I know you'll be with me always." She closed the notebook with a soft smile, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Across the room, Officer Reed watched her, knowing that tonight wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about building something new, something better. It was the beginning of a second chance for all of them. The morning sun shone through the cafe windows, casting soft rays over the small memorial corner. A photograph of Sergeant David Thompson, her father, stood proudly surrounded by flowers and letters, a tribute to his sacrifice and the love between a father and daughter. Nina sat at the same table where the memorial had taken place. Her notebook lay open, and a warm cup of cocoa sat nearby, spreading warmth through her hands as she held it. The cafe buzzed quietly with customers chatting and the sound of coffee machines, but Nina felt peaceful for the first time since her father's death. She picked up her pen, and the words flowed more easily now. "Hi, Dad. I hope you saw everything last night. It was beautiful. Everyone said the most amazing things about you." She paused, then smiled as she added, "I think you would have really liked Officer Reed, too." Across the room, Officer Reed stood near the counter, waiting for his order. He glanced at Nina, catching her eye for a brief moment. She gave him a small, shy smile, and to his surprise, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He nodded back to her, a silent promise that he would be there for her whenever she needed. After the memorial, Reed went home with a new sense of purpose. The guilt he had felt for so long hadn't completely gone away, but it was starting to change into something better. He reached out to his superiors, asking for training on how to better connect with the community and understand people better. He wanted to improve, not just for Nina, but for everyone he served. He also started visiting the cafe regularly, not to watch over Nina, but to check in as a friend. The first few visits were awkward since they weren't sure how to talk to each other, but over time, something fragile and special began to grow. As Reed picked up his coffee, Mr. Mendoza smiled at him. "You're becoming a regular," he teased. "I'm starting to think you like my cafe more than your patrol route." Reed chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not the coffee that keeps me coming back," he admitted. Mendoza gave him a knowing nod. "You're a good man, officer. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Reed stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "There's just a lot to make up for." Mendoza patted his shoulder. "The fact that you care is a good start. Just keep showing up." Reed glanced at Nina, who was now writing in her notebook. "Yeah," he murmured. "I will." A few minutes later, Nina's mother, Sarah, entered the cafe. Her face softened as she saw Nina sitting peacefully. She walked over to Reed, who stood up a little straighter, still getting used to being on good terms with her. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, looking at her daughter, "for everything." Reed shook his head, humbled by her words. "I'm just glad I could do something right." Sarah smiled faintly. "We all make mistakes, Officer Reed. What matters is that you're trying to make things better." Reed nodded gratefully, then excused himself, leaving Sarah to join her daughter. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he felt lighter, as if his past mistakes were no longer weighing him down, but guiding him towards something better. Inside the cafe, Nina finished her letter, her pen gliding smoothly over the paper. "I love you, Dad. I'll come back tomorrow. I'll always come back." She closed the notebook with a contented sigh, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Sarah sat down across from her, placing a hand over her daughter's. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked. Nina smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Good," she whispered. "I think Dad would be proud." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "He would be," she agreed. "And I'm proud of you too." Nina beamed, her mother's words filling her heart with warmth, like sunshine after a long storm. Later that afternoon, as Nina walked home with her mother, she saw Officer Reed standing near his patrol car, talking with a group of children. They were laughing, crowding around him as he showed them something from his utility belt. For the first time, Nina didn't see him as a scary policeman, but as someone who was really trying to do good. Reed caught her eye, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. He gave her a small wave, and she waved back, feeling a quiet gratitude. As they continued walking, Sarah looked down at Nina. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Nina nodded, feeling peaceful. "Yeah," she said softly. "But can we come back tomorrow?" Sarah smiled, brushing a hand over Nina's curls. "Of course, baby. We'll always come back." Nina looked up at the sky, the sun shining brightly overhead, and whispered, "I love you, Dad." As they walked down the street, hand in hand, Nina knew she wasn't alone anymore. Her father's love was with her always, and now, so was hope. The future felt brighter than it had in a long time, and Nina was ready for it. Thanks for watching. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hit the bell to get updates. While you're here, check out our other videos. There's always something new to see. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you.